Hello, folks. Today we are going to read the chapter second of Sherlock Holmes. Let's get into the story. The Science of Deduction. We met next day as he had arranged and inspected the room at room number 221B, Barker Street, of which we had spoken at our meeting. They consisted of a couple of comfortable beds and a single large, airy sitting room, cheerfully furnished and illuminated by two broad windows. So desirable in every way were the apartment, and so moderated did the terms seems to be were divided between us, that had bargain was concluded upon the spot, and we once entered into the possession. That very evening I moved my things round from the hotel, and on following the morning Sherlock Holmes followed me with several boxes and portmanteaus. For a day or two, we were busily employed in unpacking and laying out our properties to the best advantage. That done, we gradually began to settle down and to accommodate ourselves to our new surroundings. Holmes was certainly not a difficult man to live with. He was quiet in his ways and his habits were regular. It was rare for him to be up after 10 at night, and he had invariably breakfasted and gone out before I rose in the morning. Sometimes he spent his days at the chemical laboratory, sometimes in the dissecting room, and occasionally in long walks, which appeared to take him into lowest portions of the city. Nothing could exceed his energy when the working fit upon him, but now and again a reaction would seize him, and for days on end he would lie upon a sofa in sitting room, hardly uttering a word or moving a muscle from morning to night. On these occasions I have noticed such a dreamy, vacant expression in his eyes, and that I might have suspected him of being addicted to use of some narcotics, had not the temperance and cleanliness of his whole life forbidden such a notion. As the weeks went by, my interest in him and my curiosity as to his aims in life gradually deepened and increased as well. His very person and appearance were such as to strike the attention of the most casual observer. In height, he was rather over 6 feet and so excessively lean that he seems to be considerably taller. His eyes were very sharp and precise, save during those intervals of torpor to which I have alluded, and his thin, hawk like nose gave his whole expression an air of alertness and decision. His chin, too, that it had prominence and squareness which mark the man of determination. His hands were invariably poltered with ink and stained with chemicals, yet he was possessed of extraordinary delicacy of touch, as I frequently had occasions to observe when I watched him manipulating his fragile philosophical instruments. The reader may set me down as a hopeless busybody when I confess how much this man stimulated my curiosity and how often I endeavored to break through the reticence which he showed on all the concern himself. Before pronouncing judgment, however, be it remembered how objectless was my life, how objectless was my life, and how little there was to engage my attention. My health forbade me from venturing out unless the weather was exceptionally genial, and I had no friends who would call upon me and break the monotony of my daily existence. Under these circumstances, I eagerly hailed the little mystery which hung around my companion and spent my time in endeavoring to unravel it. He was not studying medicine. He had himself, in a reply to a question, confirmed Stanford's opinion upon that point. Neither did he appear to have pursued any course of reading which might fit him for a degree in science or any other recognized portal which would give him an entrance into the learned world. Yet his zeal for certain studies were remarkable, and within eccentric limits his knowledge was so extraordinarily ample and minute that His observations have fairly astounded me. Surely no man would work so hard or attain such precise information unless he had some definite end in view. Dissolute readers are seldom remarkable for the exactness of their learning. No man burdens his mind with small matters unless he was some very good reason for doing so. His ignorance was remarkable as his knowledge. Of contemporary literature, philosophy, and politics, he appeared to know next to nothing. Upon my quoting Thomas Carlyle, he inquired in the naviest way who he might be and what he had done. My surprise reached a climax, however, when I found incidentally that he was ignorant of the Copernican theory and of the composition of the solar system. That an civilized human being in this 19th century should not be aware of the earth traveled around the sun appeared to be me such an extraordinary fact that I could hardly realize it. You appear to be astonished, he said, smiling at my expression of surprise. Now that I do know it, I shall do my best to forget it. To forget? You see, he explained it. I consider that a man's brain ordinarily is like little empty attic, and you have to stock it with such furnish as you choose. A fool takes it in all the lumber of every sort of that he came across, so that the knowledge which might be useful to him get crowded out, or at the best is jumbled up with a lot of other things, so that he has difficulty in laying his hands upon it. Now the skillful workman is very careful indeed as to what he takes into the brain attic. He will have nothing but the tools which may help him in doing his work. But of these he has a large assortment and all in the most perfect order. It is a mistake to think that a little room of elastic wall can distend to any extent. Depend upon it, there comes a time when for every addition of knowledge you forgot something that knew before. It is of the highest importance, therefore, not to have useless fact elbowing out of the useful ones. But the solar system, I protested. So what's the deuce on it to me? He interrupted impatiently. You say that we go around the sun? If we went around the moon, it would not make a penny worth of difference to me or to my work. I was on the point of asking him what that work he might be, but something is matter in manner of showing that the question would be an unwelcome one. I pondered over other short conversation, however, endeavored to draw my deductions from it. He said that he would acquire no knowledge which did not bear upon his object. Therefore, all the knowledge which he possessed was such a wood as useful to him. I enumerated in my own mind all the various points upon which he had shown me that he was exceptionally well informed. I even took a pencil and jotted them down. I could not help smiling at the document when I had completed it. It ran in these ways: Sherlock Holmes, his limits. Knowledge of literature, nil. Philosophy, nil. Astronomy, nil. Politics, feeble. Botany, variable, well up in belladonna, opium, and poisons generally. Knows nothing of practical gardening. Geology, practically but limited, tells at a glance difference of soil from each other. After walks, he shows me splashes upon his trousers and told me by their color and consistence in which part of the London he had received them. Chemistry, profound. Anatomy, accurate but unsystematic. Sensational literature, immense. He appeared to know every detail of every horror perpetrated in the century. Plays the violin well, is an expert single stick player, boxer, and swordsman. He has a good practical knowledge of British law as well. When I had got so far in my list, I threw it into the fire in despair. If I can only find what the fellow is driving at by concealing all these accomplishments and discoveries, the calling which it needs them to all, I said to myself, I may as well give up the attempt once. I see that I have alluded about all these powers upon the violin. These were remarkable, but as eccentric as all his other accomplishments. That he could play piece and different pieces, and I knew well because at my request he played me some of the Mendelssohn's Lydia and other favorites. However, he would seldom produce any music or attempt any recognized air. Of an evening, he could close his eyes and scrape carelessly at the fiddle which was thrown across his knees. Sometimes the chords were sonorous and melancholy. Occasionally, they were fantastic and cheerful. Clearly, they reflected the thoughts which possessed him. The music aided those thoughts, or whether the playing was simple, the result of whim or fancy was more than I could determine. I might have rebelled against these exasperating solo had it not been that he usually terminated by them, playing in quick succession a whole series of my favorite airs as a silent compensation for the trial upon my patience. During the first week, though we had no callers, and I had begun to think that my companion was a friendless man, as if I was myself. Presently, however, I found that he had many acquaintances, and those in most different classes of society. There was one little, sallow, rat faced, dark eyed fellow who was introduced to me as Mr. Lestrade, and who came 3 or 4 times in a single week. One morning, a young girl called, fashionably dressed, and stayed for half an hour or more. The same afternoon, bought a grey headed, seedy visitor looking like a Jew peddler, who appeared to me to be more excited and who was closely followed by a slipshod elderly woman.
Leaning on his
On
armchair.
another occasion, an old white haired gentleman had an interview with my companion, and another, a rail porter in velvety uniform. When any of these nondescript individuals put in an appearance, Sherlock Holmes used to beg for these to use the sitting room, and I would retire to my bedroom. He always apologized to me for putting me to this inconvenience. I have to use this room as a place of business, he asked. And these people are my clients. Again, I had an opportunity of asking him a point blank question, and again, my delicacy prevented me for forcing another man to confide in me. I imagined at the time that he had some strong reason for not alluding to it, but he soon dispelled the idea of becoming round to the subject of his own accord. It was upon the 4th of March, as I have a good reason to remember, that I rose somewhat earlier than usual, and found that Sherlock Holmes had not yet finished his breakfast. The landlady had become so accustomed to my late habits that my place had not been laid nor my coffee prepared. With the unreasonable reluctance of mankind, I rang the bell and gave a curt intimation that I was ready. Then I picked a magazine from the table and attempted while that any time to read with it, while my companion munched silently at his toast. One of the articles had a pencil marks at the headings, and I naturally began to run my eye through it. Its somewhat ambitious title was The Book of Life, and it attempted to show how much an observant man might learn by an accurate and systematic examination of all that came in his way. It struck me as being in remarkable mixture of shrewdness and of absurdity. The reasoning was close and intense, but the deduction appeared to me to be far-fetched and exaggerated. The winter claimed by momentary expression. A twinge of a muscle or a glance of an eye, a phantom of a man's inmost thoughts, decide, according to him, was an immobilized impossibility in the case of one trained to observations and analysis. His conclusions were as infallible as so many propositions of Euclid. So startling would his result appear to uninitiated that until they learned the process by which he had arrived at them, they might well consider him as a necromancer. From a drop of water, said the writer, a logical a logician can infer the possibility of an Atlantic or a Niagara without having seen or heard of one or the other. So, all life is a great chain, the nature of which is known whenever we are shown in a single link of it. Like all other arts, science of deduction and analysis is one which can only be acquired by long and patient study, nor is life long enough to allow any mortal to attain highest possible perfection on it. Before turning to those moral and mental aspects of the matter which present at greatest difficulties, let the inquirer begin by mastering more elementary problems. Let him, on meeting a fellow mortal, learn a glance to distinguish the history of a man, and trade or profession to which he belongs. Trivial as such an exercise may seem, it sharpens the faculties of observation and teaches one where to look and what to look for. By a man's fingernails, by his coat sleeve, by his boot, by his trousers knees, by the calluses of his forefinger and thumb, by his expression, by his shirt cuffs, by each of these things a man's calling is plainly revealed. That all united should fail to enlighten the competent inquirer in any case is almost inconceivable. What is infallible, Taddle? I cried, slapping the magazine down on the table. I never read such a rubbish in my life. What is it? Sherlock Holmes asked me. Why this article? I paid. Why this article? I said, pointing at it with an egg spoon as I sat down on to my breakfast. Oh, I see that you have read it since you have marked it. I don't deny that it is smartly written. It irritates me though. It is evidently the theory of some armchair lawyer who evolves all these neat little paradoxes in the selection of his own study. It is not practical. I should like to see him clapped down in a third-class carriage on the underground. And I asked to give the trades of all his fellow travellers. I would lay 1,000 to 1 against him. Then Sherlock replied, You would lose to your money. As for the article, I wrote it myself. What? You? Yeah. I have a turn for both observation and deduction. The theory which I have expressed there and which appeared to be to you as a chimerical or really extremely practical. So practical that I depend upon them for my bread and cheese. And how? I asked involuntarily. Then Sherlock replied, Well, I have a trade of my own. I suppose I am the only one in the world. I am a consulting detective. If you can understand that, here in London we have a lot of government detectives and a lot of private ones. When these fellows are at fault, they come on to me, and I manage to put them on the right scent. They lay all the evidence before me, and I generally able, by the help of my knowledge of the history of crime, to set them straight. There is a strong family resemblance about misdeeds, and if you have all the details of 1,000 at your finger ends, it is odd if you can't unravel the 1,000 and the first. Lestrade is a well-known detective. He got himself into a fog recently over a forgery case, and that's what brought him here. And what about the other peoples? Sherlock said. They are mostly sent by private inquiring agencies. They are all people who are in trouble about something and want a little enlightening. I listen to their stories and they listen to my comments, and then I pocket my fee. And I said, But do you mean to say that without leaving your room you can unravel some knot which other men can make nothing of, although they have seen every detail for themselves? Sherlock replied, Quite so. I have a kind of intuition that way. Now and again a case turns up which is a little more complex. Then I have to brush about and see things with my own eyes. You see,
I have a lot of special knowledge which I apply to the problem and which facilitates matters wonderfully. Those rules of deduction laid down in that article which arose your scorn are invaluable to me in practical work. Observation with me is second nature. You appeared to be surprised when I told you on our first meet that you had come from Afghanistan. Remember? Watson replied. You were told, no doubt. Sherlock. Nothing of sort. I knew you came from Afghanistan. From long habit, the train of thoughts ran so swiftly through my mind, and that I arrived at the conclusion without being conscious of intermediate steps. There were such steps, however. The train of reasoning ran. Here is a gentleman of a typical medical type, but with an air of a military man. Clearly an army doctor then. He has just come from the tropics, for his face is dark and that is not the nature tint on his skin, for his wrists are very fair. He was undergone hardship and sickness as his haggard face says clearly. His left arm has been injured. He holds it a stiff and unnatural manner. Where in the tropics could an English army doctor have seen much hardship and got his arm wounded? Clearly Afghanistan. The whole train of thoughts did not occupy a second. I then remarked that you came from Afghanistan and you were astonished. I said with a smile, it is simple even as you explain it. You remind me of Edgar Allan Poe's Dupin. I had no idea that such individuals did exist outside of stories. Sherlock Holmes rose and lit his pipe. No doubt, you think that you are comparing me to Mr. Dupin, he observed. Now, in my opinion, Dupin was a very inferior fellow. That trick of his breaking in one of his friends' thoughts with an appropriate remark after a quarter of an hour's silence is really very showy and superficial. He had some analytical genius, no doubt, but he was no mean such a phenomenal as Poe appeared to imagine. Have you read about Gabriel's work? Does Leacock come up to your ideas of a detective? I asked Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock sniffed sardonically. Leacock was a miserable burglar, he said in an angry voice. He had only one thing to recommend him, and that was his energy. That book made me positively ill. The question was how to identify an unknown prisoner. I could have done it in 24 hours. Leacock took 6 months or so. It might be made a book for detectives to teach them what to avoid. I felt rather indignated at having two characters whom I had admired treated in his cavalier style. I walked over the window and stood looking out to the busy street. This fellow may be very clever, I said to myself, but he's certainly very conceited. Then Sherlock. There are no crimes in these days, he said. What is the use of having brains in our profession? I know well that I have in it me to make me very famous. No man lives or has ever lived who has brought the same amount of study and nature of talent to the detection of crime which I have done. And what is the result? There is no crime to detect, or at most some burgling villainy with a motive so transparent that even a Scotland Yard official can see through it. I was still annoyed at his bumptious style of conversation. I thought it is best to change the topic. I wonder what that fellow is looking for, I asked, pointing to a stalwart, plainly dressed individual who was walking slowly down on the other side of the street, looking anxiously at the numbers. He had a large blue envelope in his hand and was evidently the bearer of a message. Sherlock Holmes said, "Oh, you mean the retired sergeant of the Marine?" Bragg and Bones, thought to myself. He knows that I can't verify his guess? The thought I had hardly passed through my mind when the man whom we were watching caught sight of the number on the outdoor. number on our doors and ran rapidly across the roadway. We heard a loud knock, a deep voice below, and heavy steps ascending the stairs. "For Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said, stepping into the room and handing my friend the letter. Here was an opportunity of taking the conceit outside of him. He little thought of this when he made that random shot. May I ask you, my lad, I said in the bland voice, what your trade may be?
Commissioner, sir.
He had, gruffly.
Uniform away for repairs.
And you were? I asked, with slightly malicious glance at my companion.
A sergeant, sir. Royal Marine Light Infantry, sir. Right, sir.
He clicked his heels together, raised his hand in a salute, and was gone.